In the glittering halls of the Kingdom of Valdoria, where ancient traditions clash with modern expectations, a shocking revelation threatens to destroy everything the royal family has built. When Princess Isabella's carefully guarded secret finally emerges, it will shake the very foundations of the monarchy and force a nation to confront the dark truths hidden behind palace walls. What happens when the people meant to protect you become the source of your deepest pain? The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Rosewood Palace as Princess Isabella Victoria Aldridge stood before her bedroom mirror, practicing the smile that had become her armor. At 19, she had perfected the art of appearing composed while her world crumbled around her. The bruise on her shoulder, carefully hidden beneath layers of silk and lace, served as a constant reminder of the price of imperfection in the royal household. Isabella adjusted her emerald necklace, a family heirloom that felt more like a chain than jewelry. Today marked the 3rd anniversary of her mother's death, and the entire kingdom would be watching her every move during the memorial ceremony. She had learned long ago that showing weakness was not an option for a member of the House of Aldridge. The soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Your Highness, it's time," called Marcus, her personal guard. Unlike the others, Marcus had kind eyes that reminded her of her late mother's gentle nature. He was one of the few people in the palace who treated her as more than just a royal obligation. Isabella took a deep breath and opened the door, immediately noticing the concern in Marcus's expression. He had been her protector for 3 years, appointed shortly after Queen Catherine's tragic accident. And, in that time, he had witnessed the gradual transformation of a vibrant young woman into someone who jumped at unexpected sounds and flinched when people moved too quickly. The walk to the palace chapel felt endless. Courtiers and staff members bowed as she passed, their faces masks of respect and sympathy. Isabella wondered if any of them suspected the truth about what happened behind closed doors. The official story was that the princess was struggling with grief over her mother's death, but the reality was far more complex and dangerous. King Edward stood at the altar, his imposing figure draped in ceremonial robes. To the outside world, he was a beloved monarch who had guided Valdoria through economic prosperity and political stability. His subjects saw him as a devoted father raising his daughter alone after his wife's untimely death. They couldn't see the man who raged behind closed doors, whose grief had twisted into something dark and controlling. Isabella took her place beside her father, noting how his hand gripped her arm just a little too tightly as photographers captured their moment of shared mourning. The pain from his fingers digging into the bruise on her shoulder made her eyes water, which the media would later interpret as touching evidence of her continued grief for her mother. Archbishop Williams began the memorial service, his voice echoing through the ancient chapel. Isabella tried to focus on his words about Queen Catherine's legacy of compassion and strength, but her mind wandered to memories of her mother's warmth and protection. Catherine had been the buffer between Isabella and her father's increasingly volatile moods. Without her, Isabella felt like a ship lost in a storm. The congregation sang hymns that had once brought her comfort, but now they felt hollow. Isabella's voice caught as she remembered singing these same songs with her mother, who had encouraged her to pursue music despite her father's disapproval. After Catherine's death, the piano in Isabella's room had been removed, along with most things that brought her joy. During the prayer, Isabella caught sight of Marcus stationed near the back of the chapel. His presence provided the only sense of security she felt these days. He had become more than a bodyguard. He was a witness to her suffering, and perhaps the only person who might believe her if she ever found the courage to speak. The ceremony continued with readings from dignitaries and family friends, each one praising Queen Catherine's dedication to charitable causes and her role as a loving mother. Isabella's aunt, Princess Margaret, spoke about her sister's strength and independence, unknowingly highlighting everything Isabella had lost since her mother's death. As the service drew to a close, King Edward stood to address the gathering. His speech was masterful, painting a picture of a family united in grief but strengthened by love and shared purpose. He spoke of Isabella's grace and maturity, her dedication to royal duties, and his pride in the young woman she was becoming. The crowd murmured approvingly, completely unaware that these very duties had become Isabella's prison. After the ceremony, the royal family hosted a reception for visiting dignitaries and close family friends. Isabella moved through the crowd like an actress playing a role, accepting condolences and making appropriate conversation while her father watched her every interaction. She had learned to read his subtle signals, the slight narrowing of his eyes when she spoke too freely, the tight smile that warned her to end a conversation quickly. Lady Catherine Pembroke, one of her mother's oldest friends, approached with genuine concern in her eyes. "Isabella, dear, you look so thin. Are you taking care of yourself?" The question was innocent, but Isabella saw her father's reflection in a nearby mirror, his jaw tightening at the implication that something might be wrong. Isabella forced a bright smile and deflected with practiced ease. "I've been so busy with my studies and royal engagements. You know how it is." Lady Catherine didn't look convinced, but protocol prevented her from pressing further. As the reception wound down, Isabella excused herself to the palace gardens, seeking a few moments of peace before the evening's private family dinner. The rose garden had been her mother's favorite place, and Isabella often came here to feel close to her. The late afternoon sun cast everything in golden light, creating an illusion of warmth that contrasted sharply with the chill in her heart. Marcus followed at a respectful distance, giving her space while maintaining his protective watch. Isabella appreciated his understanding of her need for solitude, something her father never seemed to grasp. Every moment of her day was scheduled, monitored, and controlled, leaving little room for the simple act of being alone with her thoughts. The sound of approaching footsteps made her tense. She knew without looking that her father was coming, probably to critique her performance during the reception or remind her of the evening's expectations. Isabella quickly wiped away the tears she hadn't realized were falling and composed herself for another performance. King Edward emerged from behind a hedge of white roses, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "You did well today, Isabella. Your mother would have been proud." His words should have brought comfort, but his tone carried an undertone that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Isabella nodded respectfully, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She had learned that the safest response was often silence, even when her father seemed to be offering praise. His moods could shift without warning, and what began as approval could quickly turn into criticism or worse. The walk back to the palace felt like a march to execution. Isabella knew that the public portion of the memorial was over, and now came the private family time that she dreaded most. Away from cameras and witnesses, her father's carefully maintained facade would drop, and she would face the man whose grief had transformed him into someone she barely recognized. As they entered the palace, Isabella caught sight of her reflection in the ornate mirrors that lined the grand hallway. The young woman looking back at her appeared poised and elegant, every inch a princess. But Isabella knew the truth behind the image. She was a prisoner in her own life, trapped by duty, tradition, and a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. The evening ahead stretched before her like a minefield. Dinner with her father, where every word would be weighed and measured. Then, perhaps hours of family time, where she would endure his lectures about royal responsibility and her failures to live up to his impossible standards. Finally, if she was fortunate, she would retreat to her room where she could drop the mask for a few precious hours before starting the performance all over again. Marcus took his position outside the private dining room, and Isabella felt a pang of loss as the door closed between them. In that moment, she made a silent promise to herself and to her mother's memory. Someday, somehow, she would find the strength to break free from the golden cage that had become her life. The question was whether she could survive long enough to find that courage, and whether anyone would believe her when she finally found her voice to speak the truth that could destroy everything the royal family had built. The private dining room felt suffocating despite its grand proportions and soaring ceiling. Isabella sat across from her father at the mahogany table that could seat 20, yet tonight it felt too small to contain the tension that crackled between them. The formal place settings and crystal glasses created an elegant facade for what had become nightly interrogations disguised as family dinners. King Edward carved his roast beef with precise, methodical movements, each slice exactly the same thickness. Isabella had learned to read meaning in these small gestures, the careful control he exercised over everything around him, including her. She picked at her own meal, her appetite long since destroyed by the constant state of anxiety that had become her normal existence. "The Prime Minister mentioned your absence from the Education Initiative meeting last week," he said without looking up from his plate. His voice was calm, conversational even, but Isabella felt the familiar knot of dread form in her stomach. Isabella set down her fork carefully, knowing that any sign of nervousness would only make things worse. "I had that stomach flu, remember? Dr. Morrison said I needed to rest." The lie came easily now, though it felt like poison on her tongue. She had actually spent that day locked in her room after their previous discussion about her public appearances had left her too bruised to be seen in photographs. King Edward's knife paused for just a moment before continuing its steady rhythm. Ah yes, the mysterious illness that seems to strike whenever you have important obligations. His eyes met hers across the table, and she saw the dangerous glint that preceded his worst moments. Your mother never let illness interfere with her duties to the crown. The comparison to her mother was a familiar weapon, one that never failed to find its mark. Isabella knew that Queen Catherine had indeed been dedicated to her royal responsibilities, but she had also been gentle and understanding, nothing like the man sitting across from her now. Sometimes Isabella wondered if grief had genuinely changed her father, or if her mother's presence had simply hidden his true nature. "I'm sorry, father. I'll do better," she whispered, the words automatic after years of practice. Apologies had become her first line of defense, though they rarely prevented the storms that followed. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sounds of cutlery against china and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Isabella found herself counting the seconds, a meditation technique she had developed to survive these encounters. 1, 2, 3, breathe. 4, 5, 6, breathe. King Edward finally spoke again, his voice deceptively casual. "Lord Hamilton's son will be visiting next month for the Spring Festival. Thomas, I believe his name is. He's recently graduated from Oxford, quite accomplished from what I hear." He paused to take a sip of wine, watching her reaction carefully. "He would make an excellent match for you, Isabella. It's time we started considering your future." Isabella's blood turned to ice. Marriage had always been an abstract concept, something that would happen eventually, but remain safely in the distant future. The idea of being bound to another man, potentially one chosen by her father, felt like a death sentence. She would simply be trading one prison for another, with no guarantee that her husband would be any kinder than her current captor. "I'm only 19, father. Surely there's no rush." She tried to keep her voice steady, but she heard the slight tremor that betrayed her fear. King Edward's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Your mother was 18 when we married. She understood that royal duty comes before personal desires." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to the tone that always preceded his worst moments. "You seem to have forgotten that lesson lately." Isabella's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass, and she quickly clasped them together in her lap to hide the shaking. "I haven't forgotten anything, father. I need more time to prepare myself for such an important step." The excuse sounded weak even to her own ears, and she saw her father's jaw tighten in response. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that made her flinch. Isabella remained perfectly still, every muscle in her body tensed for what might come next. "More time," he repeated, beginning to pace behind his chair. "You've had 3 years to grow into your responsibilities, Isabella. 3 years of patience and guidance, and yet you continue to disappoint me at every turn." His voice was rising now, the careful control beginning to slip. "Your mother would be ashamed of what you've become." The words hit her like physical blows, but Isabella had learned not to react visibly to his verbal attacks. She stared at her untouched dessert, focusing on the delicate pattern of berries arranged on the porcelain plate while her father's tirade continued. "You think I don't notice your attitude, your reluctance to embrace your role? You think I don't see how you flinch away from photographers, how you avoid eye contact during public appearances?" He stopped directly behind her chair, and she could feel his presence looming over her. "You're becoming an embarrassment to this family, to the crown itself." Isabella's throat felt tight with unshed tears, but she knew that crying would only escalate his anger. Instead, she whispered another apology, the words barely audible. "I'm sorry, father. Please, I'll try harder." King Edward's hand came down on her shoulder, his fingers finding exactly the spot where yesterday's bruise was still tender. His grip tightened slowly, and Isabella bit her lip to keep from crying out. "Trying isn't good enough anymore, Isabella. Results are what matter. Lord Hamilton will be here in 3 weeks, and you will charm him. You will make him want to marry you, and you will accept his proposal when it comes." The pressure on her shoulder increased until tears sprang to her eyes despite her best efforts to contain them. "Do you understand me?" he demanded, his voice deadly quiet. "Yes, father," she managed to whisper through the pain. He released her suddenly, and Isabella had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling forward. King Edward returned to his seat as if nothing had happened, cutting another precise slice of beef while she struggled to compose herself. "Excellent," he said pleasantly, his mood shifting with the terrifying unpredictability she had learned to fear. "I knew you'd see reason. Your mother always said you were a sensible girl when you applied yourself." The rest of the dinner passed in tense silence. Isabella forced herself to eat a few bites of dessert, knowing that leaving food on her plate would be interpreted as another act of defiance. Her shoulder throbbed with each movement, and she could already feel the bruise deepening beneath her silk dress. When they finally finished, King Edward stood and kissed her forehead with what anyone observing would interpret as paternal affection. "Sleep well, my dear. Tomorrow we'll begin planning your wardrobe for Lord Thomas's visit. First impressions are so important, don't you agree?" Isabella nodded mechanically, not trusting her voice to remain steady. As soon as her father left the dining room, she slumped in her chair, finally, allowing her carefully maintained posture to collapse. The weight of her situation pressed down on her like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe. Marcus appeared in the doorway almost immediately, his trained eye taking in her pale complexion and trembling hands. "Your Highness, are you ready to retire for the evening?" His gentle tone was almost her undoing. After hours of walking on eggshells, his simple kindness felt overwhelming. Isabella stood carefully, testing her balance before taking a step. The pain in her shoulder sent shooting sensations down her arm, but she had become expert at hiding physical discomfort. The walk to her quarters felt endless, each step echoing in the empty corridors. Isabella was acutely aware of Marcus's presence behind her, wondering what he thought about the dinner that had just concluded. The dining room wasn't soundproof, and she suspected that her father's raised voice had carried to the hallway where Marcus stood guard. As they reached her door, Marcus stepped forward to open it for her, and, for just a moment, their eyes met. In his gaze, she saw something that looked like concern mixed with helpless frustration. It occurred to her that Marcus might be the only person in the palace who genuinely cared about her well-being rather than her public image or political value. "Marcus," she said quietly, surprising herself with her boldness. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded immediately, his full attention focused on her. "Of course, Your Highness." Isabella hesitated, suddenly, uncertain how to voice the question that had been haunting her for months. Do you think my mother would really be ashamed of me? If she could see me now?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both of them understood but couldn't openly acknowledge. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Your Highness, from everything I've heard about Queen Catherine, she loved you more than anything in the world. A mother's love doesn't disappear just because someone makes mistakes or struggles with difficult circumstances." He paused, then added quietly, "I think she would want you to be safe and happy above all else." His words were carefully neutral, but Isabella heard the deeper message beneath them. Safe and happy, two things that felt impossible in her current situation. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak without breaking down completely. "Thank you, Marcus. That means more to me than you know." As she entered her room and closed the door behind her, Isabella finally allowed the tears to fall. She sank onto her bed, still wearing her formal dinner dress, and sobbed quietly into her pillow. The weight of her father's expectations, the threat of an arranged marriage, and the crushing loneliness of her situation overwhelmed her completely. Outside her door, she could hear Marcus taking his position for the night watch. Knowing he was there provided a small measure of comfort in the darkness. For the first time in years, Isabella began to wonder if there might be someone who would believe her story if she ever found the courage to tell it. The clock on her mantel chimed midnight, marking the end of another day in her gilded prison. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to disappoint her father, and new reminders of how completely trapped she had become. But, for tonight, in the safety of her locked room, Isabella allowed herself to grieve not just for her mother, but for the girl she used to be and the woman she was afraid she would never become. The morning light filtering through Isabella's bedroom curtains felt harsh and unforgiving as she prepared for another day of royal obligations. 3 weeks had passed since her father's announcement about Lord Thomas Hamilton, and each day had brought new pressure to prepare for his arrival. Isabella had endured dress fittings, etiquette refreshers, and countless lectures about making herself appealing to her potential suitor. Standing before her mirror, Isabella applied concealer to the latest bruise on her wrist, a souvenir from 2 nights ago when she had hesitated too long before agreeing to learn French poetry to impress Lord Thomas. The makeup artist who came to prepare her for public appearances had taught her these techniques, though Isabella suspected the woman knew exactly why she needed such skills with cosmetics. A sharp knock interrupted her preparations. "Your Highness, Lord Hamilton has arrived early," announced her lady-in-waiting, Patricia, through the door. "His Majesty requests your presence in the blue drawing room immediately." Isabella's heart sank. She had hoped for a few more hours to steel herself for this encounter, but her father clearly wanted to catch her off guard. It was one of his favorite tactics, creating situations where she couldn't properly prepare, then punishing her when she inevitably failed to meet his expectations. She made her way through the palace corridors with Patricia trailing behind, adjusting details of her appearance. The pale blue dress had been specifically chosen to complement her eyes and suggest innocence and refinement. Every aspect of her appearance had been calculated to create the perfect impression on their guest. Marcus fell into step beside them as they approached the formal drawing room. His presence had become even more important to Isabella as the pressure mounted around this arranged courtship. She caught his eye briefly and saw encouragement there, a silent reminder that someone was watching over her welfare. The blue drawing room was one of the most impressive spaces in Rosewood Palace, with its soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and priceless artwork. King Edward stood near the massive fireplace, engaged in conversation with a young man who could only be Lord Thomas Hamilton. As Isabella entered, both men turned toward her, and she felt the familiar sensation of being evaluated and judged. Lord Thomas was conventionally handsome, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He was perhaps 25, well-dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that spoke of wealth and privilege. When he smiled at her introduction, Isabella noticed that it didn't quite reach his eyes, suggesting a calculated charm rather than genuine warmth. "Your Highness," Lord Thomas said, bowing formally before taking her offered hand and kissing it with practiced precision. "It's an honor to finally meet you. Your reputation for grace and intelligence precedes you." Isabella curtsied in response, falling back on years of training to carry her through the interaction. "Lord Hamilton, welcome to Rosewood Palace. I hope your journey was pleasant." As they exchanged pleasantries, Isabella was acutely aware of her father watching every gesture, every word, ready to critique her performance later. She had learned to divide her attention during these encounters. Part of her mind focused on the conversation, while another part monitored potential sources of her father's future displeasure. King Edward suggested they take a walk through the palace gardens, and Lord Thomas immediately offered Isabella his arm with the kind of practiced gallantry that suggested extensive experience with courtship. As they strolled along the manicured pathways, Isabella found herself being interrogated under the guise of polite conversation. "I understand you're quite accomplished at the piano," Lord Thomas mentioned as they paused near a fountain. "I'm something of a music lover myself. Perhaps you might play for me sometime during my visit." Isabella's throat tightened as she remembered the piano that had been removed from her room years ago. "I'm afraid I'm quite out of practice," she replied carefully. "I've been so focused on my other royal duties that I haven't had much time for music lately." She caught her father's slight frown at this response and quickly added, "But I would be happy to arrange for a performance by our court musicians if you'd enjoy that instead." Lord Thomas accepted this deflection graciously, but Isabella noticed how his questions continued to probe into areas of her life that had become sources of pain and control. He asked about her charitable interests, her education, her opinions on current events, all topics that her father had strong views about, and expected her to parrot perfectly. As the morning progressed, Isabella began to recognize something troubling in Lord Thomas's demeanor. There was a subtle possessiveness in how he guided their conversation, an assumption that he already had some claim on her attention and opinions. When she mentioned enjoying poetry, he immediately began explaining which poets she should read and why her current preferences were misguided. During lunch, the conversation turned to marriage expectations, and Isabella felt trapped between two men who seemed to be negotiating her future without much input from her. Lord Thomas spoke confidently about his family's estate, his plans for expanding their holdings, and his desire for a wife who could support his political ambitions. "I believe strongly in traditional marriage roles," he explained while cutting his roast lamb with aggressive precision. "A man needs a wife who understands that her primary duty is to support his endeavors and maintain the domestic sphere. Too much independence in a woman can be quite destructive to family harmony." King Edward nodded approvingly at these sentiments, and Isabella felt her last hopes crumbling. She was being transferred from one controlling man to another, with no consideration for her own desires or well-being. The realization that her father saw this as an ideal arrangement made her feel physically ill. After lunch, Lord Thomas requested a private audience with King Edward, leaving Isabella to wait anxiously in her room while they presumably discussed the terms of her future. Patricia tried to distract her with talk of upcoming social events, but Isabella could barely focus on the conversation. Marcus knocked and entered with tea service, an excuse that allowed him to check on her welfare. As Patricia stepped out briefly, he moved closer and spoke in a low voice. "Your Highness, are you managing all right? You seem quite pale." Isabella looked up at him with eyes full of desperation. "Marcus, what am I going to do? I can't marry him. He's just like..." She stopped herself before completing the dangerous comparison, but they both understood what she couldn't say aloud. Marcus glanced toward the door, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. "Your Highness, you're not married yet. Things can still change. People in difficult situations have options, even when those options aren't immediately apparent." His words were carefully chosen, but Isabella heard the deeper message. He was telling her that escape was possible, that she wasn't completely powerless despite how she felt. For the first time in weeks, a tiny spark of hope flickered in her chest. That evening, during another formal dinner with Lord Thomas as their guest, Isabella found herself studying both men carefully. Lord Thomas dominated the conversation with stories of his achievements and plans, while her father beamed with approval. They discussed her as if she weren't present, debating which of her qualities would be most beneficial to the Hamilton family legacy. "Isabella has been somewhat sheltered," King Edward explained when Lord Thomas asked about her experience with public speaking. "But she's quite trainable. With the proper guidance, she'll develop the confidence needed for important social functions." The word trainable made Isabella's stomach churn. She felt like livestock being evaluated for breeding potential rather than a human being with her own thoughts and feelings. Lord Thomas nodded thoughtfully, as if her father's assessment confirmed his own observations about her malleable nature. After dinner, Lord Thomas requested a few moments alone with Isabella on the terrace. As they stood overlooking the moonlit gardens, he moved closer than propriety strictly allowed, and spoke in a voice that he probably intended to sound romantic, but felt threatening to her ears. "Isabella, I hope you understand how fortunate we both are in this arrangement," he said, placing his hand over hers on the stone railing. "Your father has raised you to be exactly the kind of wife I need, and I can provide you with the security and guidance that every woman requires to truly flourish." His grip on her hand tightened slightly as he continued. "I know that modern women sometimes have foolish ideas about independence and equality, but I can see that you're too intelligent to be swayed by such nonsense. Together, we'll build something lasting and meaningful." Isabella nodded and smiled, playing her expected role while inside she screamed with frustration and fear. Lord Thomas interpreted her silence as agreement and leaned closer, clearly intending to kiss her. At the last moment, Isabella turned her head slightly, so that his lips brushed her cheek instead, a small act of defiance that felt enormous in her constrained world. "I should return inside," she whispered, pulling away gently. "It's getting quite cold." Lord Thomas smiled indulgently, as if her modesty was exactly what he expected from a proper young lady. "Of course, my dear. We have plenty of time to get better acquainted before our wedding." The casual assumption that their marriage was already decided made Isabella's knees weak. As they walked back inside, she caught sight of Marcus stationed near the terrace doors. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw her own desperation reflected in his expression. That night, after Lord Thomas had retired to the guest wing, and her father had delivered his approval of her behavior during the evening, Isabella sat alone in her room, contemplating her future. The walls that had always felt confining now seemed to be closing in completely. In just a few months, she would be Lady Hamilton, trapped in a new prison with a man who saw her as property to be managed rather than a person to be loved. As she prepared for bed, Isabella made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She could not, and would not accept this fate. Somehow, she would find the courage to escape, even if it meant risking everything she had ever known. The alternative, a lifetime of being passed between controlling men who saw her as an object rather than a person, was simply unacceptable. Outside her door, Marcus began his nightly watch, unaware that the princess he guarded was planning something that would change both of their lives forever. In the darkness of her room, Isabella began to plan her escape from the golden cage that had become her entire world. The engagement announcement was scheduled for the following morning, though Isabella had never actually agreed to marry Lord Thomas Hamilton. Her father had simply informed her that the decision had been made, and the palace press office was already preparing statements for the media. The weight of inevitability pressed down on her as she sat in her room, staring at the engagement ring that had appeared on her dresser like a shackle waiting to be locked in place. Isabella turned the ring over in her hands, noting how its substantial weight seemed to mock her own powerlessness. The emerald was beautiful, she supposed, surrounded by diamonds that caught the morning light and threw rainbow patterns across her walls. In any other circumstances, it might have been a symbol of love and hope. Instead, it represented the final closing of her cage. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Your Highness." Marcus's voice carried a note of urgency that made her look up sharply. "Might I have a word? It's rather important." Isabella opened the door to find Marcus glancing nervously down the hallway, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like excitement mixed with fear. She stepped back to let him enter, noting how he closed the door more firmly than usual behind him. "Your Highness, I've been giving considerable thought to our conversation yesterday," he began, his voice carefully low. "About options for people in difficult situations." He paused, seeming to gather his courage before continuing. "I may have discovered something that could help you, but it would require tremendous courage on your part." Isabella's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" Marcus moved to the window, ostensibly checking the grounds, but actually ensuring they couldn't be overheard. "There's someone who might be willing to help you tell your story publicly. Someone with enough influence and credibility to make people listen, even when it means challenging the royal family itself." He turned back to face her, his expression serious. "Lady Catherine Pembroke has been asking questions about you. She's noticed things that others have missed or chosen to ignore. More importantly, she has connections with journalists who specialize in investigating powerful people who abuse their positions." Isabella felt a mixture of hope and terror wash over her. Lady Catherine had been her mother's dearest friend and had always shown genuine concern for Isabella's welfare. If anyone might believe her story, it would be someone who had loved Queen Catherine and understood what kind of mother she had been. "But, Marcus, the consequences," Isabella began, then stopped as the full implications hit her. "If I speak publicly about what's been happening, it won't just affect me. It could destroy the entire monarchy. People who depend on the stability of the crown could be hurt." Marcus nodded solemnly. "I've thought about that too, Your Highness. But continuing to protect an institution by allowing abuse to continue isn't really protection at all. It's just perpetuating a lie that will eventually destroy everything anyway." He moved closer, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Your Highness, I've been your guard for 3 years. I've seen things that no one should have to endure, especially not someone so young and innocent. You're not responsible for saving an institution that has failed to protect you." Isabella sank into the chair by her window, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Marcus was suggesting. Speaking out would mean admitting her own victimization publicly, subjecting herself to scrutiny and disbelief from millions of people who saw her father as a beloved monarch. It would mean destroying her family's legacy and potentially facing legal consequences for defaming the crown. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked quietly. Marcus pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Lady Catherine is hosting a charity luncheon this afternoon for mental health awareness. The irony isn't lost on me," he added grimly. "She specifically requested your attendance, and your father has already agreed since it fits with the narrative of you being a dutiful princess supporting worthy causes." He handed her the paper, which contained an address and a simple message. "When you're ready to speak, I'm ready to listen." "CP, she'll have journalists there?" Isabella asked, her voice barely audible. "Discreet ones. People who understand the gravity of what you'd be sharing and the importance of handling it responsibly," Marcus confirmed. "But, Your Highness, once you speak, there's no taking it back. Your life will change completely, and I can't predict exactly how." Isabella stood and walked to her mirror, looking at the reflection of a young woman who appeared composed and privileged while hiding devastating secrets. For 3 years, she had protected her father's reputation at the cost of her own well-being. She had allowed herself to be broken down piece by piece rather than risk the consequences of speaking truth to power. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" she said without turning from the mirror. "Of course, Your Highness. Do you think I'm strong enough to do this? To face everything that will come after?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with conviction. "Your Highness, you've survived 3 years of psychological torture while maintaining your dignity and compassion for others. You've protected palace staff from your father's wrath by drawing his attention to yourself instead. You've endured isolation, manipulation, and physical abuse while still trying to be the daughter your mother raised you to be. He paused. If that's not strength, I don't know what is. His words broke something loose inside Isabella, and she began to cry quietly. For so long, she had felt weak and cowardly for not standing up to her father. Hearing Marcus acknowledge her suffering and recognize her efforts to protect others helped her see herself differently. There's something else you should know, Marcus continued gently. I've been documenting things. Photos of injuries when I could manage it discreetly, records of incidents, changes in your behavior and health. I never intended to use them without your permission, but I thought someday you might need proof. Isabella turned to stare at him in amazement. You've been building a case? Marcus nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. I know I overstepped my role as your guard, but I couldn't stand by and watch you suffer while having no way to help you. If you decide to speak out, you won't be facing this alone or without evidence. The magnitude of his loyalty and dedication overwhelmed her. Marcus had risked his career and possibly his freedom to protect her, even when she hadn't asked for his help. He had seen her pain and taken action to give her options, something no one else in her life had ever done. A sharp knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Isabella. King Edward's voice carried the edge that always made her freeze with anxiety. We need to discuss your appearance for this afternoon's luncheon. Open this door immediately. Isabella and Marcus exchanged a look of panic. If her father entered now and sensed that something significant had passed between them, both of their lives could be in danger. Isabella quickly wiped her tears and gestured for Marcus to move to his usual position by the window. Coming, father, she called out, forcing her voice to sound normal. King Edward entered with the commanding presence that filled any room he occupied. His eyes swept over Isabella's appearance critically before settling on Marcus with suspicious intensity. Marcus, you're dismissed for the afternoon. I'm assigning additional security for the luncheon, he announced coldly. Princess Isabella will be accompanied by Captain Morrison instead. Isabella felt her heart sink. Captain Morrison was completely loyal to her father and would report every conversation, every interaction, every moment of the afternoon. If she was going to act on Marcus's suggestion, it would have to be without his protection and support. Father, I prefer having Marcus with me, Isabella said carefully. He knows my routines and preferences better than anyone else. King Edward's expression darkened at this small act of defiance. Your preferences are irrelevant, Isabella. Captain Morrison is more experienced with public events, and, frankly, Marcus has become too familiar in his duties. A professional distance must be maintained. The dismissal was clearly punishment for something, though Isabella couldn't be sure whether her father suspected their conversation or was simply asserting his control before the engagement announcement. Either way, she was being separated from her only ally at the worst possible moment. After her father left with final instructions about her behavior at the luncheon, Isabella found herself alone with a decision that would determine the rest of her life. In a few hours, she would be at Lady Catherine's event, surrounded by people who might help her tell her story. But she would be watched carefully by someone loyal to her father, making any attempt to speak out extremely dangerous. Isabella looked again at the engagement ring sitting on her dresser, then at the note from Lady Catherine promising to listen if she found the courage to speak. The afternoon stretched ahead of her like a crossroads, with one path leading back to the familiar prison of her current life, and another leading toward an uncertain but authentic future. As she prepared for what might be the most important day of her life, Isabella thought about her mother's words from years ago. Courage isn't the absence of fear, darling. It's doing what's right despite being afraid. Queen Catherine had been talking about a different kind of bravery then, but Isabella realized that her mother's wisdom applied perfectly to her current situation. The time for silent endurance was coming to an end. Today, one way or another, Princess Isabella would decide whether to remain a victim of her circumstances or become the author of her own story, regardless of the cost. Lady Catherine Pembroke's estate felt like stepping into another world after the oppressive atmosphere of Rosewood Palace. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows onto gathered guests who chatted earnestly about mental health initiatives, completely unaware that they were about to witness one of the most significant moments in royal history. Isabella moved through the crowd with practiced grace, Captain Morrison shadowing her every step with military precision. Unlike Marcus, who had learned to give her breathing room while maintaining security, Morrison stayed close enough that she could feel his presence like a physical weight. Every conversation was monitored, every smile catalogued for later reporting to her father. Lady Catherine approached with the warmth that had made her Queen Catherine's closest friend. Her silver hair was elegantly styled, and her eyes held the same gentle intelligence that Isabella remembered from childhood visits. But today, there was something else in her expression, determination mixed with carefully controlled urgency. "Isabella, my dear, you look absolutely radiant," Lady Catherine said, embracing her warmly. "Though perhaps a bit thin. Are you taking proper care of yourself?" The question was innocent enough for Captain Morrison's ears, but Isabella caught the deeper meaning. Lady Catherine was letting her know that she had noticed changes, that someone was paying attention to her welfare beyond royal protocols and public appearances. "I've been very busy with royal duties," Isabella replied carefully. "You know how demanding the schedule can be." Lady Catherine nodded knowingly. "Indeed. Sometimes I think we expect far too much from young people in your position. The pressure can be quite overwhelming, I imagine." She paused meaningfully. "Speaking of which, I have someone I'd love you to meet. Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She's doing groundbreaking work with trauma survivors. I think you'd find her research fascinating." Isabella's pulse quickened. This was clearly not a random introduction. Lady Catherine was offering her an opening, a chance to speak with someone who would understand the complexities of her situation. But, with Captain Morrison listening to every word, any meaningful conversation would be impossible. "I would enjoy that very much," Isabella managed, hoping her voice conveyed more than her words could safely express. As Lady Catherine led them across the room, Isabella noticed several people who didn't quite fit the typical profile of charity luncheon attendees. They were well-dressed, but carried themselves with the alert watchfulness of journalists. Her heart began to race as she realized that Lady Catherine had assembled exactly the kind of audience that could amplify her story if she found the courage to tell it. Dr. Mitchell proved to be a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an air of professional competence that inspired confidence. She shook Isabella's hand warmly while studying her face with the trained attention of someone accustomed to recognizing signs of distress hidden beneath polite facades. "Your Highness, I'm honored to meet you," Dr. Mitchell said. "Lady Catherine tells me you're interested in supporting mental health initiatives. It's wonderful to see young people of influence taking these issues seriously." Captain Morrison stepped closer, clearly intending to monitor their conversation closely. Isabella felt her opportunity slipping away before it had truly begun. How could she possibly convey 3 years of suffering and fear while under such scrutiny? "Dr. Mitchell," Isabella began carefully, "I'm particularly interested in helping young people who might be trapped in situations where they can't speak freely about their experiences. What would you recommend for someone in that position?" Dr. Mitchell's expression sharpened slightly, and Isabella saw a recognition flicker in her eyes. "That's an excellent question, Your Highness. Often, the first step is simply acknowledging that the situation exists. Many victims of ongoing trauma feel isolated and convinced that no one would believe them if they spoke out." She paused, glancing meaningfully at Isabella. "Sometimes it helps to know that there are people trained to listen without judgment, and that speaking truth doesn't make someone disloyal or ungrateful, even when they've been told otherwise repeatedly." Isabella felt tears threatening and blinked rapidly to maintain her composure. Dr. Mitchell was clearly aware that this wasn't a theoretical discussion, and her words felt like permission Isabella had been waiting years to receive. Captain Morrison shifted restlessly beside them, perhaps sensing undercurrents in the conversation that he couldn't quite identify. "Your Highness, perhaps we should move on to meet the other guests," he suggested firmly. Before Isabella could respond, the lights in the room dimmed, and Lady Catherine approached the small podium that had been set up near the windows. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. We have a very special surprise this afternoon." Isabella's stomach dropped as she realized what was happening. Lady Catherine was creating an opportunity for her to speak publicly, with witnesses and cameras present to record whatever she chose to say. The room fell quiet, and all eyes turned expectantly toward the podium. "Our dear Princess Isabella has graciously agreed to share some thoughts about the importance of mental health awareness, particularly for young people facing difficult circumstances." Lady Catherine's eyes met Isabella's across the room. "Your Highness." Isabella felt Captain Morrison's hand move toward her arm, clearly intending to prevent her from approaching the podium. In that moment, she thought of Marcus's words about her strength, of her mother's definition of courage, and of the woman she might become if she could find the bravery to speak her truth. "Thank you, Lady Catherine," Isabella said, stepping forward before Captain Morrison could stop her. I would be honored to share my thoughts. As she walked toward the podium, Isabella felt as though she was moving through water. Every step felt monumentous, each breath a conscious choice. The faces in the audience blurred together, but she could sense their attention like a physical force. Captain Morrison had followed her closely and now stood just behind her left shoulder, his presence clearly intended as intimidation. Isabella gripped the edges of the podium and looked out at the gathered guests, seeing some familiar faces among the mix of charity supporters and carefully placed journalists. "Thank you all for your dedication to mental health awareness," she began, her voice steadier than she had expected. "This cause is particularly close to my heart because I've seen firsthand how devastating it can be when young people are trapped in situations where they cannot seek help." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "For 3 years, I have lived with the consequences of remaining silent about my own experiences. I've told myself that protecting others was more important than protecting myself, that speaking truth would cause more harm than continuing to endure in silence." The room had grown completely still. Isabella could feel Captain Morrison's tension behind her, could practically hear him trying to decide whether to intervene physically. Lady Catherine watched from the front row with encouraging eyes, while Dr. Mitchell had moved closer, ready to provide support if needed. "But I've learned that silence in the face of abuse doesn't protect anyone," Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger. "It simply enables the abuse to continue and teaches victims that their suffering doesn't matter as much as maintaining appearances." Captain Morrison stepped forward, clearly intending to end her speech, but Lady Catherine rose from her seat and fixed him with a stare that stopped him in his tracks. "The princess is speaking," she said firmly. "Surely you wouldn't interrupt a member of the royal family while she's addressing invited guests?" Isabella seized the moment of confusion to continue. "My father, King Edward, has spent the past 3 years systematically breaking down my confidence, isolating me from anyone who might support me, and using physical violence to control my behavior. The loving father that the public sees is a carefully constructed facade designed to hide the reality of what happens behind palace doors." A collective gasp went through the room. Several people had pulled out phones to record, while others sat in stunned silence. Isabella could see Captain Morrison speaking urgently into his radio, undoubtedly calling for immediate intervention. "I am scheduled to be engaged tomorrow to Lord Thomas Hamilton, a marriage I never agreed to and actively oppose. This arrangement was made without my consent as part of my father's plan to transfer control of me to another man who shares his views about women as property to be managed rather than people to be respected." Isabella's voice broke slightly as she reached the most difficult part of her revelation. "I am speaking now because I cannot bear the thought of other young people, royal or otherwise, believing that they must endure abuse in silence to protect institutions or family reputations that clearly don't deserve protection." The sound of vehicles approaching outside suggested that palace security was arriving to contain the situation, but Isabella pressed on. "I know that speaking these truths will have consequences for me personally, and I accept that responsibility. But I refuse to accept that maintaining the monarchy's public image is more important than acknowledging that abuse of power can happen anywhere, including in institutions we're taught to revere without question." As Isabella finished speaking, the room erupted into chaos. Journalists were making calls and sending messages, while other guests sat in shocked silence. Dr. Mitchell had moved to Isabella's side and placed a protective hand on her shoulder, while Lady Catherine approached the podium with tears in her eyes. Captain Morrison was speaking urgently with someone on his radio, while palace security officers entered the room. Isabella knew that her moment of freedom was ending, but she had done what she came to do. Her story was now public, witnessed by people who could ensure it reached a wider audience. "Your Highness," Dr. Mitchell said quietly, "are you prepared for what happens next? Once this story breaks, your life will change completely." Isabella nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace despite the chaos around her. "Dr. Mitchell, my life changed 3 years ago when my mother died, and left me alone with a man whose grief turned him into a monster. Today, I'm just choosing to stop pretending that situation is acceptable." As palace security moved to escort her from the room, Isabella caught sight of Marcus near the entrance. He had somehow managed to arrive despite being dismissed from duty, and his presence gave her strength for whatever was coming next. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and she saw pride and admiration in his expression. The ride back to Rosewood Palace was conducted in tense silence, with Captain Morrison making frequent phone calls to coordinate damage control. Isabella stared out the window at the familiar countryside, knowing she was seeing it as a princess for perhaps the last time. By evening, her story had spread across social media and news outlets worldwide. The palace had issued statements denying her allegations and suggesting that grief and stress had affected her mental stability, but the damage was done. Too many people had witnessed her speech, and Dr. Mitchell's professional assessment of her credibility carried significant weight. Isabella sat in her room, officially under palace guard, while lawyers and advisors debated how to handle the crisis she had created. The engagement to Lord Thomas had been quietly postponed, and she could hear urgent conversations happening throughout the palace as her father's advisors scrambled to manage the fallout. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. To her surprise, Marcus entered carrying a tea service, somehow having convinced the guards to let him perform this one last duty as her protector. "Your Highness," he said quietly as he set down the tray, "I wanted you to know that Lady Catherine has arranged for legal representation and a safe place for you to stay while everything gets sorted out. You're not facing this alone." Isabella felt tears of gratitude fill her eyes. "Marcus, thank you for giving me the courage to speak. I don't know what happens next, but I know I couldn't have continued living the way I was." Marcus smiled, and for the first time since her mother's death, Isabella saw genuine hope reflected in someone else's eyes when they looked at her. "Your Highness, you've done something incredibly brave today. Whatever the consequences, you've taken control of your own story, and no one can take that away from you." As night fell over Rosewood Palace, Isabella prepared for an uncertain future that was nevertheless entirely her own. The golden cage had been unlocked, and though the world outside was frightening and unpredictable, it was also full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. For the first time in 3 years, Princess Isabella fell asleep without fear, knowing that she had finally found the courage to speak her truth, and that tomorrow would bring the first day of whatever life she chose to build for herself.